What if a dog witnessed something no human ever should, and refused to forget? At the edge of a frozen bridge, in the first light of day, a German shepherd lets out a single, piercing bark. Not once. Again. Again. Something is wrong, and he's the only one who knows it. By the time someone listens, a secret buried in silence will begin to unravel, and what they find will shake a quiet town to its core. If you're new here, welcome. Tell us where you're listening from, and if this story stirs something in you, don't forget to subscribe. Some truths only come to light when someone refuses to walk away. A late winter chill lingered over the town of Pine Hollow, Wyoming, where the land stretched quiet and open beneath a pale sky. The fields still held patches of frost, and the wind carried the scent of melting snow and pine. Just beyond the town's edge, where the old forest brushed against the foothills, a weathered stone bridge arched over Willow Creek, its reflection rippling in the early light like a memory refusing to fade. Scout, a young German shepherd with a thick sable coat and alert amber eyes, padded along the muddy path near the bridge. He was strong and lean, about 2 years old, with a cautious yet curious demeanor. His ears twitched with every sound, his nose constantly sweeping the ground, catching whispers of the world left behind. Life had not been kind to Scout. He had spent his early days chained behind a junkyard, half-starved, until one day he escaped during a thunderstorm. He had been living wild for weeks before Walter Harris found him. Walter was a retired blacksmith in his late 60s, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-worn skin and a limp in his left leg from an old accident. Since the passing of his wife, Walter had grown quieter, the lines on his face deepened by both time and solitude. He didn't say much, but there was a warmth in his movements, the kind that came from hands used to building and repairing, never destroying. Walter didn't name the dog at first. He simply opened the shed door, laid down a blanket near the forge, and left a bowl of stew by the fire. Scout had watched him from the edge of the woods for 3 days before finally creeping inside. From that night on, they were rarely apart. Walter walked slowly with a cane, and Scout adjusted his pace to match. The townspeople began to notice the pair, the old man and his silent companion, strolling side by side through morning fog and sunset gold. On this particular morning, the air was crisp, and Scout's breath came in soft plumes as he sniffed along the river path. Walter had let him out early, trusting the dog's instincts. Scout knew this route well. He liked the bridge, especially the mossy rocks beneath it where animals left messages only he could read. But today something was different. The wind shifted, bringing with it a sharp, unfamiliar scent. Oil, sweat, and something faintly sweet. Scout stopped, ears perked, nose high. Ahead, near the base of the bridge, a tall man stood half hidden in the morning mist. The man was dressed in a dark wool coat and jeans. He looked around nervously, one hand holding a bundle wrapped in a checkered flannel blanket. His shoulders were hunched and his breath came in shallow bursts. Scout crouched low behind a thicket of bare shrubs, watching. The man knelt near the base of the bridge, glancing over his shoulder, then gently placed the bundle beside a large stone. He whispered something Scout couldn't hear, then stood and quickly walked away toward a black pickup parked at the tree line. The engine started, and within moments, he was gone. Scout waited, heart pounding. Something about the man's scent stirred a deep unease in his chest. He crept forward, slowly approaching the stone. The bundle didn't move at first, but then there was a sound, barely audible over the breeze, a whimper, a tiny, helpless cry. Scout stepped closer. The blanket shifted slightly, revealing the edge of a pale forehead, a small red face, and clenched fists waving weakly in the cold. It was a baby, alone, wrapped tightly but shivering. Scout stood frozen, the image locked into his memory. He paced in a tight circle, sniffing, whining, then sat down and lifted his head. His bark shattered the stillness, loud, sharp, desperate. He barked again and again, echoing across the trees and the sleeping town beyond. His whole body shook as he barked, a call not just for help, but for understanding. Far off in the distance, from a trailhead near the pine grove, 2 figures paused. A young couple, out for an early hike. They looked toward the sound, confused, then concerned. Scout barked again, moving back and forth between the bridge and the path. Something in his movement made them start toward him, unsure of what they would find. In the space between night and day, between solitude and salvation, Scout remained by the bundle, refusing to leave. His eyes stayed fixed on the trail, his body pressed against the cold earth. He was no longer just a stray, not anymore. Scout didn't stop barking. His voice rang out into the quiet woods like a fire alarm cutting through sleep. He paced tight circles around the bundled infant, nose flicking to check that the baby still breathed, then returned to the path and barked again, louder, sharper, with a desperation that didn't belong to animals, but to those who feared time was slipping too fast. A crow took flight overhead, startled from its perch, and still the dog barked. From across the trees came the sound of footsteps, light and quick on the gravel path. Scout turned, ears forward, as two figures rounded the bend. Ryan Anderson was tall, lanky, and wore a red windbreaker that flared behind him like a cape. His hands were stuffed into his backpack straps, and his breath fogged as he jogged. His wife Claire followed close, shorter and strong, with dark curls tied back in a thick braid. They had been married for just over a year, both teachers from nearby Buffalo Grove, on a weekend hike to shake off winter and breathe something purer than city air. Ryan heard the barking first, mistaking it for coyotes, but Claire, ever the sharper listener, had stopped him mid-step. "That's not a pack," she'd said. "That's one, and it's not angry, it's calling." Now they stood on the trail, breath caught in their throats as Scout came into view. His eyes locked on them, body rigid, not in threat but in focus. Then he turned and ran toward the bridge, paused, looked back, and barked once, high and urgent. Ryan hesitated, but Claire had already started forward, calling gently, "What is it, boy? What's wrong?" Scout bounded to the stone ledge and stood beside the bundle, tail lowered, stance protective. The Andersons reached the bridge, slowed, and their breath caught in their chests when they saw what Scout was guarding. A baby, red-faced and wriggling weakly, wrapped in a flannel blanket that had begun to soak up the morning chill. Claire dropped to her knees instantly, pulling off her gloves and leaning close. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Ryan, it's a baby. It's really a baby." Ryan had already pulled out his phone, his voice low and tense as he dialed 911. Scout stood just behind Claire, eyes flicking between the baby and the road, muscles coiled with silent alertness. "Emergency services, what's your location?" the operator asked. "We're at Willow Creek Bridge just off Forest Lane, north side of Pine Hollow," Ryan said quickly. "We found an abandoned baby, breathing but cold. We need an ambulance now." Claire gently checked the infant's limbs, muttering reassurances under her breath. The baby stirred slightly, let out a broken cry, then fell silent again. Scout whimpered beside her, his entire frame taut with concern. Claire looked up at Ryan. "He saved this baby," she said softly. "This dog, he wouldn't leave it." Sirens were still far off when the paramedics arrived. Scout stood between them and the bundle at first, teeth bared not in menace but in refusal. It wasn't until Claire stepped forward and gently touched his head that he moved aside. One of the paramedics, a middle-aged man with glasses and kind hands, knelt beside the baby and lifted her into a foil blanket, whispering softly as he checked her breathing. "She's cold, but responsive," he said to his partner. "We might have been minutes from losing her." A young deputy arrived next, named James Carter. He was new to the county, barely 30, with sandy hair and the calm manner of someone who had grown up in big skies and long silences. He listened carefully to Ryan and Claire's account, nodding, then turned to the dog. "This him?" he asked. Claire nodded. "He wouldn't let us leave until we saw her. I think he's the reason she's still alive." James crouched slightly, offering a hand. Scout sniffed him warily, then sat, still watching the baby. The deputy's voice was thoughtful. "I've seen a few rescues in my day, but never led by a dog." The baby was taken to Pine Hollow Regional Hospital. Claire rode in the back with her, hand lightly resting on the tiny body, while Ryan followed in their car. The deputy stayed behind with Scout, who refused to leave the bridge. James made a quiet call to animal control, but when the voice on the other end asked if the dog was dangerous, he answered without hesitation. "Number, he's loyal, that's all." The sun had begun to rise higher now, melting frost along the stones. Scout sat quietly beside the bridge, tail curled around his feet, eyes watching the road where the ambulance had gone. He didn't know what came next, but something inside him settled. He had done what needed to be done, and for the first time in a long time, he was not alone. At Pine Hollow Regional Hospital, the baby lay nestled in a warmer under soft lights, her breathing slow but steady, the pink returning to her cheeks with each passing hour. Nurses moved gently around her, adjusting monitors and whispering in softened voices, as if to preserve the fragile quiet around her crib. The pediatrician on duty, Dr. Elise Walker, a woman in her early 40s with streaks of silver threading through her tightly pinned brown hair, watched closely. She had delivered hundreds of babies in her career, but there was something about this one that held her longer than usual. Perhaps it was the way the infant clutched a piece of the blanket with determined fingers. Perhaps it was the mark on her tiny shoulder. Dr. Walker leaned down, brushing the fabric aside to look again at the faint outline. Just beneath the curve of the left shoulder blade, a birthmark shaped like a flame flickered in her skin. Not a rash, not a bruise, but something permanent and unmistakable. Elise took a photo for the file and made a quiet note on her chart. She had seen a similar mark before. Years ago, the thought clung to her longer than it should have. Meanwhile, Deputy James Carter sat in the family consultation room across the hall, reviewing the initial reports. The flannel blanket had no identifying tags. The formula bottle found near the baby's side had no fingerprints besides the ones lifted from the carrier handle-loan set, partial, possibly male. Surveillance footage from a gas station 10 miles out had captured a dark pickup truck heading toward the Creek Road around 5:20 a.m., but the plate was obscured by mud. James rubbed the back of his neck, the way he always did when things didn't line up neatly. The silence of small towns often made the echoes of buried things louder. Scout had been temporarily taken in by the local shelter while waiting for animal control to assess his situation. But word had already spread across Pine Hollow. People didn't forget a dog that saved a baby. The shelter director, a soft-spoken man named Joe Langley, had taken a liking to Scout immediately. "This boy's got a soldier's soul," he said, watching Scout sit motionless near the kennel door, ears pricked toward every passing footstep. When Joe approached with a leash, Scout didn't flinch, didn't pull. He walked with quiet purpose, almost as if waiting for a task only he could understand. Back at the hospital, Claire and Ryan returned to check on the infant they couldn't stop thinking about. Claire carried a soft blue hat she'd knitted the night before, her fingers moving more out of worry than creativity. They stood silently by the window, watching the baby sleep, until a nurse stepped in and whispered that someone was asking to see them. It was Walter Harris. Walter had driven himself to the hospital after hearing the news from a neighbor. The moment he entered the room, Scout's name came up, and so did the bridge. Walter was a man who carried memory in his posture, shoulders slightly curved from years of work and loss. His beard was streaked with gray, and his hands were calloused, but his voice held a steadiness that made people stop talking and listen. "I think I've seen that mark before," he said, eyes resting on the photo Dr. Walker had shared with the deputy. James looked at him carefully. "Where?" Walter hesitated. "My late wife, Evelyn. She had a sister who disappeared after a family dispute. Before she left, she had a baby. No one in the family knew where the child went, but Evelyn showed me a photo once. That baby had a birthmark. Looked just like this." James leaned forward. "What was the sister's name?" "Laura Mitchell," Walter said. "Haven't seen her in over 20 years. The name sparked something in Claire's memory. She looked at Ryan, her voice soft. "That was the name in the missing persons article I read last year, the woman who vanished after reporting a custody issue." Dr. Walker opened the file drawer and retrieved a copy of the infant's intake documents. "There's no ID, but the baby's in good health. She's about 2 weeks old. No signs of neglect, just exposure. Whoever left her didn't want her to die." James nodded slowly, piecing together threads he wasn't ready to tie just yet. We'll need to reach out to state records, see if there's any DNA on file from Laura Mitchell or her family. Walter stood quietly, staring at the photo again. If this is Evelyn's niece, then she might be my granddaughter. His words hung in the air, a possibility, not yet a truth, but strong enough to make hearts pause. In the kennel, later that evening, Scout sat beside his food bowl, untouched. When Joe opened the gate and knelt beside him, Scout pressed his head against the man's chest with a low, heavy sigh. It was the sound of a dog who knew his job wasn't done. Not yet. It had been 2 days since the baby was rescued, and the snow lining the streets of Pine Hollow had begun to melt into thin streams that ran between the sidewalks and gutters. Outside the sheriff's office, the clouds gathered low and heavy, threatening another quiet storm. Inside, Deputy James Carter leaned over his desk, examining the latest set of reports and photographs. The information was thin, and time was pressing. But then something shifted the stillness. The name Eli Harper appeared in a police record from 7 years prior, tied to the very same family that Walter had mentioned. A man once investigated during the disappearance of Laura Mitchell, though never charged. James leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming the edge of his desk. He needed more than old files and coincidences. Meanwhile, at the Pine Hollow Animal Shelter, Scout had become restless. The German Shepherd paced the length of his enclosure, his claws clicking against the concrete, head turning sharply at every passing footstep. Joe Langley, the shelter director, had tried everything to soothe him, but Scout would not eat or rest. He sat by the door as if waiting for someone to open it with purpose, his golden brown eyes focused on something only he could sense. That afternoon, James arrived, having promised Walter he'd check on Scout personally. When he stepped inside the kennel, Scout stood instantly, ears pricked, tail motionless. James knelt beside him, extended a hand, and for the first time, Scout pressed his head forward without hesitation. "He wants to go back to the bridge," Joe said quietly from the doorway. "He's got something he needs to show you." James didn't laugh. He didn't scoff at the idea that a dog might remember. Instead, he stood and nodded. "Get me a leash." An hour later, Scout led James down the path they had walked once before. But this time, Scout didn't stop at the stone ledge. He veered to the right, where a trail of flattened grass led through the brush and behind the tree line. James followed, boots crunching against dry leaves, until Scout paused beside a half-buried tarp wedged beneath a tangle of roots. James crouched, tugged at the corner, and uncovered an old satchel, soaked through but intact. Inside was a baby bottle, a pair of infant socks, and a small digital voice recorder. James turned it over in his hands. The buttons were scratched, and the casing was cracked, but it still lit up when pressed. He slipped it into his jacket pocket and gave Scout a long look. "You really don't forget, do you?" Back at the station, James sat alone in the evidence room, the recorder set on the table in front of him. He pressed play. The voice was male, steady but strained. "If anyone finds this, I didn't abandon her. I tried to keep her safe. She's my daughter. Her mother, Laura, disappeared because she was being hunted. The Mitchells never forgave her for what happened with their estate, and I wasn't strong enough to protect them both, but I couldn't let them take our baby. I know someone will find her. Please, take care of her." The recording ended in a soft click. James sat still, staring into the silence. The name Eli Harper was now more than a name on paper. He was a man carrying fear, regret, and something heavier still, love disguised as sacrifice. James picked up his phone and dialed Walter. "You might want to come down to the station," he said quietly. "I think we found something that changes things." That evening, as Walter listened to the recording, his face grew pale. "Eli was Evelyn's nephew," he said slowly. "They were close before the family fell apart over the estate. He vanished after Laura disappeared. Some folks said he ran, others said he was hiding." James nodded. "I don't think he's a criminal. I think he's a father doing what he thought was the only option." Back at the shelter, Scout finally ate. Slowly, deliberately, his appetite returning for the first time in days. Joe watched from the corner, arms crossed, murmuring softly. "That boy remembers more than we do." Later that night, Walter stood at the forge behind his cabin, the same one where Scout had first taken shelter. The fire inside glowed low, casting long shadows across the wooden beams. He held the photo of Evelyn's family, now crinkled and faded at the edges. In it, a younger Eli stood beside Laura, both smiling beneath a canopy of trees. On the back, Evelyn's handwriting curled in faded ink, "Family, no matter what." Walter looked down at Scout, lying at his feet now, finally resting. "You brought her back to us," he whispered. "And now we follow." The snow returned to Pine Hollow under cover of night, drifting down in soft, unhurried spirals that blanketed rooftops and hushed the town into stillness. In the sheriff's office, the glow from a single desk lamp pooled across scattered notes and photographs. Deputy James Carter sat hunched over a transcribed version of the voice recording found in the satchel. Every word had been etched into his mind. Each syllable of Eli Harper's voice was a doorway to a truth far more complicated than law or duty could define. Across the room, Walter Harris stood silent, arms crossed, his weathered features drawn tight in thought. The old man hadn't said much since hearing the recording, but his presence filled the room like thunder before a storm. "Do you think she's still alive?" Walter asked at last, his voice low and steady. James looked up, eyes tired but resolute. "We don't know, but if Harper's telling the truth, Laura might still be out there, and if she is, she may be watching, waiting for a sign it's safe to come home." That sign came sooner than either expected. That morning, as Scout walked beside Walter through the narrow path leading to the edge of the old Mitchell farm, the dog stopped abruptly, nose lifted, ears sharp. The farm had long since been abandoned. Its barn collapsed inward like a broken rib cage, the house windows boarded up, but Scout knew something had changed. He sniffed the air, tail stiff, then veered toward a patch of untouched snow behind the barn. There, in the powdery surface, were fresh footprints, small, light, hurried, and beside them, something more chilling, a torn piece of fabric with a child's embroidered name, Lily. Walter bent down, heart thudding, brushing snow from the letters. The cloth was from the same flannel blanket the baby had been wrapped in. "She was here," he whispered. Back in town, James compared the footprints against a set found earlier near the creek. They matched. Laura had returned, if only briefly. And then, just before sunset, the sheriff's department received a call. A hiker near the Red Pines had found a woman, cold and exhausted, sitting by a fire built beneath a rock overhang. She wouldn't give her name, but she asked if the baby was safe. James and Walter drove together. Scout rode in the back, head between the seats, silent and alert. They arrived just as paramedics were helping the woman into a heated vehicle. She was in her early 30s, face pale, eyes sunken but strikingly familiar. Her hair, now a deep chestnut, was tucked under a wool cap. She gripped a scarf with both hands, refusing to let it go. James stepped forward, his voice gentle. "Ma'am, I believe you know someone named Eli Harper." Her eyes flicked up, startled, and filled with something deeper than fear, grief, hope, recognition. "My name is Laura," she said quietly. "Laura Mitchell. Where's my daughter?" The ride to the hospital was quiet. Laura sat beside Walter in the back seat, Scout curled on the floor at her feet. She looked down at him, almost afraid to meet his gaze, then slowly reached to touch the thick fur on his neck. "I remember this dog," she whispered. "He was there the day I ran." Walter turned toward her. "Why did you leave?" Laura's voice broke as she spoke. "My family threatened Eli when they found out about the baby. They said they'd take her, said I was unfit. I believed them. Eli tried to fight, but they had money, lawyers. He told me to hide. He said he'd find a way to protect her. Then one night, he disappeared. I thought he was gone for good." James, hands on the wheel, said nothing, but his jaw clenched. At the hospital, Laura was reunited with her daughter. Nurses brought the infant in, now stronger, cheeks flushed with color. Laura reached for her with trembling arms, tears falling freely. The baby blinked up at her, yawned, and wrapped tiny fingers around her mother's thumb. The room fell silent. In a corner, Scout sat quietly, tail thumping once against the floor, his job unfinished but shifting. His eyes moved between mother and child and Walter, whose hand rested on the back of a nearby chair. No words were needed. The reunion said more than any confession ever could. That night, as snow blanketed the town again, Walter placed a photo back onto his mantle. It was an old picture of Evelyn and Laura, arms wrapped around each other in the garden behind the forge. He lit the hearth and sat beside it, Scout curled at his feet. A family was beginning to come back together, not by force, not by luck, but by loyalty and quiet bravery. By late March, the snow had melted from the shoulders of Pine Hollow and given way to the soft stirrings of spring. Willow Creek ran fuller now, murmuring against the stones of the old bridge where it had all begun. Beneath the whisper of wind through budding branches, life was beginning to return in quiet, deliberate ways. Laura Mitchell stood on the porch of Walter's home, her daughter asleep in her arms. Her hair had grown long enough to fall gently over her shoulders, and her face, once drawn and wary, now carried the light of someone who had begun to believe she was no longer hunted. In her arms, baby Lily stirred with a soft sigh, curling against her mother's chest. Walter opened the door slowly and smiled, stepping aside to let them in. He wore a clean blue flannel and jeans that hung a little loose now. Something in his presence felt more grounded, as if a weight had shifted deep within him. He had spent years in silence, forging metal that outlasted memory, but today he had something softer to protect. Scout padded beside him, ears relaxed, tail swaying like a metronome. The dog had not left Lily's side since the reunion. Laura often joked that he had memorized her breath. In the center of the living room, resting on an old quilt laid across the rug, sat a new bassinet made from walnut and hand-sanded by Walter himself. It wasn't perfect. The corners were a little uneven and the finish blotched in places, but every inch of it held the shape of his care. Laura placed Lily inside gently and tucked the blanket over her small chest. Her eyes lingered on her daughter's face, then drifted to the fireplace, where the faint crackle of wood punctuated the stillness. Later that day, James Carter arrived with documents folded in a weathered leather folder. The deputy, whose quiet intensity had become familiar in the household, looked more tired than usual but more satisfied too. He set the folder on the table and handed Laura a simple pen. "The custody papers are finalized," he said softly. "It's official. She's yours, Laura. No questions left." Laura signed her name with trembling fingers. There was no ceremony, no applause. Just the sound of ink on paper and a deep exhale that felt like freedom. Outside, Scout waited by the bridge, his ears turned slightly at every creak of the woods, every rustle of squirrels gathering early spring leaves. He was still vigilant, but there was something calmer in him now, a steadiness that came not from training but from trust. Ryan and Claire Anderson stopped by in the afternoon, bringing fresh bread and a knitted yellow hat Claire had finished just that morning. Ryan's tall frame ducked beneath the doorway, his face lighting up when he saw Lily sleeping. Claire, always warm, hugged Laura without hesitation. "She's safe now," Claire whispered. "You both are." That evening, the family walked together to the creek. Walter carried Lily in a sling across his chest, one hand resting lightly against her back. Laura walked beside him, her fingers brushing against his now and then, her eyes tracing the outline of the bridge. Scout led the way, never straying far. When they reached the middle of the arch, Laura paused and looked out over the water. The light was gold, just beginning to settle across the surface in quiet ripples. She reached into her pocket and took out a photograph, folded once. It was a copy of the one found in the satchel. Laura and Eli, smiling in the garden long ago. She tucked it between two stones on the side of the bridge, a place where the wind could reach it, but not carry it away. "He's still out there," she said. Walter nodded beside her. "And he'll come home when he can. Until then, we carry the story." Scout lay down at her feet, head resting on his paws, eyes turned toward the tree line. He didn't bark, didn't move. He simply watched, knowing his part was not over, even if the danger had passed. The town of Pine Hollow would never quite be the same. People spoke of the dog that saved a baby, the woman who returned from the shadows, and the man who built a cradle from wood and forgiveness. But more than anything, they spoke of the bridge, where silence had once hidden a child, and where love had quietly returned her to the world. A plaque was placed there weeks later, mounted in the stone. It read, to the guardian who never looked away. Sometimes the ones who change our lives the most never speak a single word. Love, when guided by loyalty and quiet courage, finds its way even through silence and snow. Scout didn't need to understand the world to protect what was precious. He simply stayed, and in staying, saved a family. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to let us know where you're listening from and consider following along. There are still so many untold stories waiting, just beyond the bridge.